Hello, Amy from raisingarrows.net, and I am super excited about today's video because we are going to be talking about how our grandmothers and great grandmothers and beyond used to meal plan and what we can learn from them to make meal planning for us easier than we typically make it nowadays. And so I am excited to jump into this topic because this was something that was weighing really heavily on me for quite some time. I actually was just tired of meal planning. There was a point in time where I was so sick of meal planning, I couldn't even think straight. It was actually kind of paralyzing to try to figure out day in and day out, week after week, month after month, what to feed my family. And probably that is the number one thing that I burn out on the quickest when it comes to homemaking, because there's so many factors in there. You have to think about special diets. You're thinking about, is this healthy? You're thinking about whether you've got this nicely balanced nutritional meal. And not to mention the fact that I am typically feeding upwards of 10 people for every single meal. So you can see why it might be a little bit exhausting for me and why that might be something that I would burn out on. However, if you look back across the ages at women in my same situation with the same number of children, did they stress as much as I was stressing about meal planning? I don't think so. And that led me to call my mom. Now, I am the baby of the family, and my mom had me in later years. And so my mom is actually 83 years old. So she's in a different generational category than maybe your mother is. Add to that the fact that my grandmother is still alive and she is 103. So I had a wealth of resources to pull from. And then my mom was actually raised part of the time by her grandmother, my great grandmother, who is no longer living. But that way I could get some information from how my mom, my grandmother, and my great grandmother did their meal planning, and what could I learn from them about simplifying my own meal planning and taking the stress out of all of it. So that's what I want to share with you today. All right, so I told you I called my mom in desperation. It was late one evening and I just kind of poured it all out there, and I was like, this is the biggest stressor in my life. I feel completely paralyzed by making a meal plan. I do not seem to be able to do it, and I don't ever remember you being stressed out by meal planning, and I'm pretty sure my grandmother and my great-grandmother weren't either. Now, after my mom got over the fact that this was my biggest stressor in homemaking, because I was right, it was not something that had stressed her out, she was able to then kind of talk me through, and it was more of a discussion, like me asking questions and her sharing her input and what she remembered from her childhood with her grandmother and then also her own mother. There's a little bit of a unique situation there that I will share here in a bit, but it actually turned out to be a super fruitful conversation for me. And I learned so much. Now, one of the reasons I decided to talk to my mom about this was because I actually talked to a woman who was from another country. She was from Serbia, and she was telling me how incredibly complicated American meals are. She said in Serbia, they have a meat, they have a potato, they have a vegetable, and there's not a lot of seasonings, and it's basically the same thing day in and day out. And she said there's just so many ingredients in American food. And that got my wheels turning initially. And then as I continued along this process of not being able to meal plan and being completely stressed by it and wondering what in the world we were going to have day in and day out, I thought back to that conversation that I had had with her. My family are German, or what you might call Russian Mennonites. And we came from an area in Ukraine after leaving our home country. We were brought over to Ukraine, and then we left there to come to the United States. Most of my family came to the United States in the early 1900s, bringing with them their traditions and their foods and their culture. My mother was the first of her family to marry outside of the German Mennonite culture. So they were a close-knit community that typically stuck to their own. They lived in bigger communities in the United States where they were able to farm and continue on with their culture. I grew up with a lot of the traditional German or Russian Mennonite foods. I've shared some of those here and on the blog, so you can look at those recipes and kind of get an idea of what I was used to eating as a kid and what I continue to feed my own family. On my father's side, they were mostly Irish, and he grew up in a small community with his mother and father and his grandparents nearby. However, my dad passed away several years ago, and so I wasn't really able to talk to him about what he grew up eating. However, I'm pretty sure he had a typical American diet. He was born in 1924, lived through the Depression, and probably ate mostly a meat and potato and bread type of diet with some vegetables thrown in. But because I was able to talk to my mom about her own grandmother and my grandmother and then her lifestyle as well, I got a pretty good idea of how most of the communities of that day ate in the area I grew up in, at least. So first of all, she shared with me that a lot of the meals were rotated. They had the same things over and over and over. She said breakfast was often eggs and bacon and toast. You never got seconds. You ate what was put in front of you and then you headed off to school. I do know that my great-grandparents would have eaten zwieback that had been toasted from the weekend. So over the weekend, they would have made a fancy double bun bread. Basically, it has a bun here and then a little top knot on top. Then they would have toasted that on Monday and had that with coffee quite often as a breakfast or as tea time. The children also might have gotten that in their lunch pails as well because it was a super simple way to send bread with them. Otherwise, the bread was rye, graham, or some variation thereof. The only white bread they ever had was on Sunday, and it was typically zwieback. Lunch was either what was served in the cafeteria or some sort of sandwich or leftovers. When Mom came home from school, she said they usually didn't have a snack, but occasionally you would get a cookie and half a glass of milk. Children were walking all over the community, and they were quite busy and quite active. I've often heard it said that many parents told their children if they were hungry between lunch and dinner, they didn't eat enough at lunch and they would spoil their dinner if they had a snack. That seems to be true of what she was used to as well, but she said occasionally if they were really hungry, they would get a cookie and half a glass of milk. For the evening meal, it was repeated over and over again, like I said. Typically, supper consisted of a meat, a potato, and a vegetable. The vegetable was usually whatever was in season or whatever could be purchased at the store. While her grandmother, my great-grandmother, made homemade bread, she said by the time her mom and she herself were cooking, they were not making homemade bread. They were always buying it store-bought. I do remember growing up that we almost always had a piece of bread buttered and folded over with our dinner. My dad loved that. I thought it was a little weird, but that's what we had. So bread was just kind of part of the meal. You just always had it. My mom did say that typically the potatoes were mashed. Occasionally it was au gratin or it was fried, but typically it was a mashed potato. And of course it was real mashed potatoes made from real potatoes, not from the box. Depending on the meal, it was either white or brown gravy that was served with the meat, and typically the meat was whatever they had personally butchered at their farm or whatever they could buy from the local butcher. Both of my parents grew up in small towns, as did I, and so typically the shopping was done every single day, not necessarily weekly. Mom rarely had a grocery list because she knew what she needed to pick up at the store because we always had the same thing, and that was the way she had grown up as well. She did say that eventually we started having more and more casseroles. And so they would slice up potatoes, they put some meat in there, maybe some veggie and like cream of chicken or cream of mushroom soup. That became kind of all the rage, I think back in the 50s and 60s. And so she saw more and more casseroles. It was an easy way to put together a meal. And I do remember eating a lot of casseroles growing up. She also said that she doesn't remember anybody eating salads when she was a kid. If you look at old cookbooks, when you see the word salad in the cookbook, it almost always means a gelatin salad. So basically Jell-O with all kinds of stuff stuck in it. I cannot believe the things people would put into gelatin back in the 50s. It's kind of gross, but hey, it was all the rage. So I guess That's what salads were. But Mom said she does not remember anybody putting together lettuce and tomato and cucumbers and all kinds of other vegetables and then putting a salad dressing on it. In fact, if you talk to older people and use the word salad dressing, they will typically think you are talking about Miracle Whip. And yes, my friends, I grew up on Miracle Whip. I don't eat it anymore, but it was kind of a thing. So that was what my family ate, and that was what my dad called salad dressing. However, my mom did say that they often ate cucumbers and radishes and corn and all kinds of things like that straight from the garden. They just ate them raw. They weren't putting them into a salad. So whatever was being harvested from the garden typically made it to the table unless it was being processed for jams and jellies and preserves. She also said that my great-grandmother never made a meal plan. In fact, she didn't really make a meal plan until I was a kid, and my grandmother as well never made a meal plan. So it just kind of wasn't how homemakers did things, which really fascinated me because what are we told all the time as a culture of homemakers now? Make a meal plan. Interestingly enough, they did not do that. I think that's because of what my friend from Serbia said. There isn't a lot of choice. There weren't a lot of ingredients. Things were simple. Meals didn't require a lot of extra spices and ingredients to create the meal. They just used what they had. There was no need for a meal plan because you had the cuts of meat that you got from the butcher or whatever you had on hand from butchering your own animals. You used those. And then you used whatever potatoes you had, whatever vegetables you had, and whatever bread you had made on baking day. It wasn't overly complicated and you didn't have to overthink it because there just wasn't a lot of choices. Now, this can be considered a really good thing. I love the fact that I can have a different thing every single night of the week. In fact, I think I might get bored if I did have the same thing over and over again. But that was their lifestyle and that was the way things were. And actually, when I think it through, I can imagine that being much simpler. Less choices means you have less things to think about, less things to consider. It doesn't cause you decision fatigue. And let me tell you, decision fatigue is a real thing when it comes to meal planning these days. Also, my mom said they never really considered nutritional value of foods. They weren't concerned about the fact that they had peas and carrots along with potatoes and bread. Oh my, so many carbs. We would not do that these days, would we? But they did. In fact, my mom said the only vegetables she served were the vegetables that her kids would eat. Now, as an aside, when I say her kids, I am one of her kids as well. However, I came along much later in life, and so her older kids are the ones she was talking about. But she also served whatever vegetables I would eat as well. I just know that our eating changed by the time I came along. There was a marked difference between how my older siblings ate and how I ate. And I'll tell you about that a little bit more here in a second. But like I said, she'd go to the store, she'd buy whatever vegetable they ate, and she said it was typically corn and green beans, and it was in a can. Because by that point, yes, she had a garden, but they were moving a lot, and sometimes the garden wasn't producing. So she bought what she could in a can from the store. She did say that almost every single dinner meal did have meat with it, except when they had waffles. And I grew up eating these waffles as well. They were nice, fluffy waffles served with syrup, but also served with a milk sauce. And I'll tell you a little bit about this milk sauce. Basically, you warmed up milk and sugar, and then when it kind of got hot and starting to boil, you would drizzle the batter from the waffles into it to create these chunks of waffles, and that was the waffle milk sauce. I love it to this day. Not everybody in my family is as crazy about it as I am, but that's what I grew up eating. She also said sometimes they did themed meals, like Monday was meatloaf and Tuesday was goulash and so on and so forth, but typically it was what they had on hand. My mom also started cooking very early on, probably about age 8, because my grandmother ended up going to work after World War II. So my mom did all the cooking cooking for her, her brothers, and her mom, because by that point, her mom was a single mother. My mom continued to be a homemaker all throughout her adult life. She had odd jobs here and there, ran a daycare, cleaned the church, did things like that, but she never worked outside the home for very long at any time. So all of my memories include my mom being there for all meals and making all the meals. I actually didn't grow up making very many meals at all, and I've tried to remedy that with my own children. Not that my mom meant for that to be a hindrance to me as an adult, but it's just something that happened. I was really busy with school and sports and extracurricular activities, and she said she felt guilty asking me to do much of anything when it came to homemaking skills. So I told you things changed between the time my older siblings were little and I was born. I actually think those things changed somewhere in the 80s. And when I looked into this, what I discovered was that it was in the 80s that the government decided to become involved in what we ate. They came out with all sorts of guidelines, and we started thinking more and more about food, what we were eating, and whether or not it was a balanced diet. You could say this was a good thing because people learned more about nutrition, but I also think it was a bad thing because you know what came right along with it? Diet culture. Companies like Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and Nutrisystem came on the scene in order to help women to lose weight. Now, I'm sure this happened well before the 80s, but it was kind of a build-up to the point where definitely in my household, the diet changed, the menu plan changed, and what we were eating definitely changed. I've never asked my mom whether she was on a diet when she was a kid, but I do think she did try to watch what she ate because people in her family were overweight. In fact, she told me as most of her family members got older, they put on weight. But if you look at most cultures, even the cultures that we look up to for their amazing diets, like the Mediterranean cultures, the French culture, and so on, you do tend to see that. As people age, especially women, they did tend to be more sedentary and they did start to put on weight because they didn't change how they ate. They continued to eat the same amount of bread and pasta and meats that they ate before. In our culture, we are desperate to try to not gain weight as we get older, but I think it is a little bit part of the natural cycle of life. I don't know, I'm not a big fan of it, but we'll see how it pans out. But the difference that happened was definitely there. From the time that my siblings were little to the time that I was little, Mom was more concerned about menu planning and what we were eating and whether or not it was nutritious. We were eating more and more salads, more and more greens. My dad called them rabbit food. I distinctly remember having pizzas on pita bread with tomato sauce and bean sprouts. That is not something my great-grandmother would have made. And I think that's where the downward spiral of meal planning started. We were trying so hard to diet and eat nutritiously and eat a balanced meal that we became completely overwhelmed by food. There were good foods and bad foods, and sometimes those changed. For a while, eggs were the culprit, and then they were not. We were told that everything needed to be low fat, and suddenly we realized when you take out the fat, you have to add sugar, and that's not so great. So what I think we can learn from our great-grandmothers and our grandmothers and our mothers about eating sensibly and having a meal plan is that we need to make it simple. We need to think about what we have on hand and keep the ingredients simple and not just be adding and adding and adding to the things that we have to do in a day by creating super elaborate meal plans. On my blog, I have a post about what we can learn from the homemakers of previous generations, and I just want to share with you a few of the takeaways I discovered during this journey of thinking through meal planning and why it had gotten so complicated and how I could emulate my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother in my meal planning skills. So first of all, if you have the ability to have a garden, grow what you can. It's an absolutely wonderful, noble thing to do. However, make sure you're growing food that your family actually likes. Don't grow a lot of food that nobody's gonna eat. Grow things that your family likes and then eat those things. I don't have the ability to have a full-blown garden, so I have containers on my deck and I grow lettuce and spinach there. It's something that we will eat. We would probably eat some onions and some cucumbers and things like that if I had a bigger space, but I don't. So I buy from friends, I buy from the farmer's market, and I buy from the store. But if you have the ability to have a garden, there is no reason for you to grow things that nobody in your family is going to eat. So don't do it. Don't waste your time. Put your energy into the foods that your family actually likes. Secondly, meals follow a formula. Like I said, you had meat, potatoes, a veggie, and bread. That's what they did day in and day out. Maybe your formula is not going to look quite like that, but if you follow a very simple formula without a lot of extra ingredients, you'll be able to pull together a meal from just about anything you have in your pantry. And that's the third point I want to make. Keep those kinds of foods on hand. Keep easy ingredients on hand. Don't get caught up in all the extra spices and such. Buy things you know your family is going to eat and put together your meal from the things that you have on hand. And one last tip is to eat less snacks. The less snack foods you have on hand, the less likely that's what you're going to be turning to. It's not very nutritious, and it's not something you probably ought to be eating copious amounts of. As I said, my mom rarely got a snack, and when she did, it was one cookie and half a glass of milk. How often do our kids eat a lot of potato chips, a lot of cookies, a lot of this and that? It's just not necessary, especially if you want them to eat a good meal that evening. Now, where do we go from here? How do we simplify this meal plan? Well, I think the first way to do it is to recognize your preferences and your family's preferences. Put together a meal plan that your family's actually going to eat. There are lots of fads when it comes to nutrition these days, and you really need to shut those fads out of your life and create a meal plan that makes sense for you. In fact, I highly recommend Michael Pollan's book In Defense of Food, because in there he has simple food rules that make sense, that let food be food. And it's very obvious what is food and what is not food. We don't need to get much more wrapped around the axle than that. Food really shouldn't have a ton of rules. It really shouldn't have a ton of regulations. We should be able to eat healthy meals. Feeding our family should not be the bane of our existence. Meal planning should be simple, effective, and cost efficient. And that starts with having a pantry that works for you rather than against you. I'd highly encourage you to clean your pantry out of anything that you're just not eating, and start stocking your pantry, your refrigerators, and your freezers with food that you actually like and that your family will actually eat. I'll link below to a master pantry list that I have that may help you start processing through what those foods are and what you want to have on hand, so that you can just pull out of the freezer, refrigerator, and pantry and create a meal from scratch that does not require a lot of excess ingredients and a lot of thought. You might also want to take a look at my video on scrap saving for some frugal ideas for making meals stretch and for saving some of those leftovers for another day that your family will actually eat. Hopefully this has helped you understand a little bit better what homemakers of past generations were doing for meal planning and why it was so much simpler, and what you can do to create a more simple meal plan that doesn't stress you out. Now, if for some reason your meal plan doesn't stress you out, kudos to you. I am so happy for you. But I know for me, simplifying our meal plan and not stressing over all the different choices of food and diets and nutrition actually helped save my sanity. If you start to learn the natural rhythm of the seasons and of your own body, you will start to realize that during different seasons you crave different things. And if you've eaten a lot of carb-heavy food, there will come a point when you really want some vegetables. And that creates a cycle of eating that is much more natural and much more in tune with the way God created our bodies and this earth. So until next time, happy eating, happy meal planning, happy shopping. I hope it all makes sense and helps you be a better homemaker.